I agree, it is a complicating factor for sure. And one of the reasons I think is that there is not one sustainable solution that everybody would agree upon. John just mentioned different in geography, and you can expect coming from Sweden where I'm living now, anytime you talk about conservation of forests, people think about recreation, about having spare time and having a place to enjoy life. When you say setting forest aside for conservation in the developing world, people might look at it as less revenues possible, potentially less wealth in the country. So normally when you have sustainability standards, you have to have kind of a consensus where the three areas that John was talking about, the people representing economic sector, environmental sector, and social sector, they probably, as they sit down, I have been in a number of working groups like that, if everybody has to live with a little bit of a pain, everybody has to live with a little bit of a, well, I gave in something. Because if someone comes out saying, wow, this was a perfect thing, I didn't give in anything and the others gave more, that's probably not sustainable. That will be a problem in the end. Everybody has to find the right balance of the social and environmental and economic to be able to go forward. And of course, standards are set in different ways, with different governance, set in different bars of what you need to do. Sometimes standards are recognizing legality, sometimes standards are recognizing what they would say is sustainable. And of course, it would be great if the message to consumers would be simpler than that, but it's not the case. I think if you look at any commodity, you find a multiplicity of different standards available. And I think from a company perspective, we try to find the area where we believe represents our interests, but also represents properly the interests of the other stakeholders, and we try to go for that.
And Jan, Willem, you must be, because you're already 50% of your goods coming from certified sources, I mean, how do you know, who is really auditing this certification? How do you really know which ones you can trust and all that sort of thing?
Right. Well, first of all, I think we've decided to set up our own sustainable agriculture code for agriculture commodities. So let's say our suppliers do have to meet our own standards, so to say.
Right.
That is the program we have. And for that, we use partners and we also use certification. For palm oil, we use the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil audits. For tea, we use the Rainforest Alliance. We use fair trade as well. So all these schemes can help us in order to meet our own standard and then our own targets which we have set. That is, let's say, the way of working, and of course it helps if you can inform the customers and the consumers about the activities, about the programs, so it helps. And therefore I think we will continue to work with these certification bodies. Transparency is key. I mean, people who want to know more need to be able to find the information, be it on the internet, what is it about. And with modern communication, I think there's a lot we can do, and also an area where improvements can be made.
And what about the point of expense that was made here? I mean, you know, does it necessarily add a cost?
Well, I'm with the person asking the question. If it's mainstream, you know, if you have really a critical, let's say, volume, then the cost will not be the barrier. But you need a certain volume, you need a supply chain, and then it can work.
And Richard, can I ask you about the number of these schemes that are out there, and are there some that are better than others, and how do you get a real sense of a system that can work?
I think where you start, your question is the right one. I mean, I think we should look at any of these systems in terms of it's a tool. What does that tool do, and does that actually meet the objectives we're trying to get to? It's an amazing success that in the last 4 or 5 years we've seen really both an explosion in terms of uptake of credible certified standards. So we talked about FSC. That's gone in the last 5 years from 9% of production timber to 16%. That doesn't 16 is not enough, but that's already that's a percentage a year. That's actually starting to move very significant volumes. Willem-Jan just mentioned the RSPO for palm oil. Palm oil, 5 years ago, there was no such thing as certified sustainable palm oil on the market 5 years ago. It's now 16% of production. Unfortunately, allied to that, although the producers are actually doing their very best to actually change their practices and become more sustainable, only roughly half of that sustainable palm oil is actually being bought and actually by the companies and actually put into products. So there is still a mismatch there. There will always be some sort of gap between it. Two other very quick points. One is that, yes, I think it is getting very confusing because there are so many different systems and labels out there in the market. I think there will be a shake-up in the coming years. You will see, as you see, it's becoming real business with real drivers behind it. You will see some winners and losers. I think we'll start to see some either mergers or takeovers amongst the certification systems, which will be interesting to see. And what we also see now are governments getting involved. And that's also, I think, actually it's a sign of success. We should be actually pleased about this. But again, we should be very careful, as Mario suggested, about whether if you like, the sustainable labels that governments are putting on products are actually more than just legality. Because that's, if you take the example of the Indonesian palm oil system, it calls itself the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil System. It is essentially a legality standard. It's good, we need it. It's an absolute minimum basis that we need to have for production in that country. But then we have to recognize there are steps that we have to make beyond this towards real sustainability. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time in the coming years, and we really have to come back to judging these systems. Do they deliver the impacts that we want on the ground, and do they also not give too many costs and complications for actually whether it's the farmers, the foresters, or the fishers who are actually involved in the production side? And we should remember their costs and their complications as well.
Let's just take a question here.
Yes, my name is Annemarie Kerkhoff from Ecovies. I have a question for Willem-Jan Laan. You mentioned that you work with different certification schemes, and I wonder, do you have insight in how consumers react to these different labels? And secondly, let me think, what was it?
Well,
yeah, maybe
we can ask this one first, and you can be thinking.
Right.
So,
working with different schemes and consumer reaction, I think generally, I think positive. I mean, it's for them also a recognition that you do, let's say, have a scheme in place in order to, let's say, show the end user the origin of the product, of the raw material. So generally positive. So we have several examples where we see positive consumer reaction, let's say, as far as the market is concerned.
but if a consumer had to choose between something that was cheaper and something that had that label on, I mean, somebody was telling me yesterday that for instance, there's a new study that's saying people don't care about CO2 coming from cars. They're looking at the price and not the emissions. So
there are various studies in that area, but let me just give you one example. I mean, you have a brand on the market, and if, let's say, 20% of the consumers of that particular brand do want to be assured, let's say, about the origin of the raw material, and want to see something either on pack or through information they receive otherwise, then this 20% is a critical part of the business. So as a consumer goods company, you want to supply your product for the full 100% of your consumers, including the 20% who show this keen interest. And of course, this will also evolve. I mean, when you have discussions on climate change, you know, people want to see more assurance there. And I think there we see that actual programs are also needed in the supply chains in order to make it happen. I mean, palm oil was just the example given, but we have other examples where, let's say, more can be done with the help of partners, but also with the help of governments in order to get there. And that's an area, of course, for today as well, where we, let's say, have a keen interest. I mean, sourcing from within the European Union, We do not often talk about that.
No.
But let me just bring in that also within the European Union, we are not there yet. I mean, sustainable agriculture is, I think, used in the new CAP program, and that program is now in place. But I've looked at the reactions from WWF on the CAP program, and then I think more work is to be done. Also on the implementation. I mean, how do we deal with emissions, for example, in agriculture and animal husbandry? How do we deal with water issues in the Mediterranean countries, let's say for the production of olive oil in Spain? So we're not there yet within the European Union. So also there we want to know more about the origin, the sustainability of the production system, so that we as a company can say we source from European origin, and that is accurate, it's sustainable, there are systems in place to ensure that the environmental impact is really taken care of. And then of course we have all the demands we have for imports from third countries.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to come back with another question?
Yeah, you mentioned also that the certification schemes can be improved, and I wondered, like, what main improvements do you think are necessary?
Well, let me give you an example of two systems. I mean, we have the Rainforest Alliance system, which is, let's say, focusing on the environmental impact to a large extent. Then we have Fair Trade, who is covering the social impact to a large extent. Well, as a company, we want to cover both. So we want to cover the environmental and the social aspect. So can the system improve? Well, probably they can work together, learn from each other. But we as a company, we need more than let's say, the one pillar certifies. Thank you.
Okay. We had a question at the back. Yes, a gentleman here, I think, was first. In fact, I'm not sure. It's very difficult to say. I'm sorry.
Simon Levitt, Harwood Levitt Consulting. A question about raw materials as they're used in Europe, and thinking of the wider theme of the circular economy. A lot of the raw materials, I don't know who this is a question to, but a lot of the raw materials discussed this morning, fish, coffee, tea, paper for cartons, etc., is renewable. So I guess my question is can something only eventually be sustainably sourced if it's renewable? Are we talking about that smaller category of raw materials, or can everything be sustainably sourced?
I'll put that to Richard. What do you think?
I mean, if you ask a geologist, he'll tell you that oil and gas are renewable as well. But only that you have to wait several billion years for them to renew themselves. I think, I mean, it's been described by many people, we're in this sort of very strange fossil fuel era of about 150 years. All before that, everything was bio-based and based on renewable natural resources, and probably 50 to 100 years out again, it's going to have to be again, because it is going to come to an end. So I think, I mean, this is the overall theme of the conference, of course, and not particularly this session, but I think, ultimately, if you like, the short cycle renewable products in terms of human lifetimes are the things that we're going to have to learn to live with and use in a much more frugal way than we are at the moment, because it's already challenging now, and we have another couple of billion people coming down the track in the next 3-4 decades, and an enormous, very positive growth in wealth and well-being in some very large emerging economy countries, but of course that will lead to enormous consumption impacts as well.
John, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, the same thought occurred to me. So I think from my perspective, maybe a bit purist, but sustainable sourcing would be about renewable resources. I mean, there is, you do hear the term sustainable mining, but I think you would need, it's a different discussion, which is more about the global theme of this week, looking at the whole production chain, including recycling. But for purposes of this discussion, I think we're focusing mainly on these sectors.
And when we're talking about, sorry, Richard.
And I was just going to say, well, we already mentioned aluminium. I mean, the most sustainable aluminium you can source is the aluminium that's not coming from virgin sources. So you can save already 80% of the energy use by recycling. So, I mean, I think, again, giving the right triggers in terms of where we're sending our economy and our sourcing patterns that go with it are really, really important.
I know that you're working in the trade sector now, and how much does this play in trade deals, for instance? You know, if you're doing free trade associations with other countries, are you making demands on each other and saying we want to be sure that anything coming in is sourced correctly? How much does it play in the FTAs?
Yeah, there's in the most so we have at the moment the EU is negotiating bilateral agreements with a number of countries, and the three most recent agreements with Korea, Peru, Colombia, and Central America, and all of those have a specific chapter which is called Trade and Sustainable Development, and that has a number of elements. One is a recognition of certain principles. So one principle is that the standards should not be lowered for purposes of obtaining a trade advantage. So that both sides say that they'll maintain the standards or improve them.
Standards of what sort of standards?
On environment and labor, basically.
Environment and labor, okay.
Yeah. And then there's reference to the international agreements to which on both, so this is ILO conventions and the multilateral environmental agreements to which both sides are parties, so that also provides the context. And then there's also, we are interested in negotiating and having a positive agenda for how trade can benefit can benefit conservation of biodiversity through sustainable use. So there is some interesting language in these agreements. Now the question is putting it into practice. And that's one of the challenges we now face, because it's a big task of articulating actors in Europe, in our partner countries, private sector, civil society, government, and it's a task that's only just beginning.
So to make that happen more widely, do you need these sort of certification schemes, or do you need, or would the standards that you're looking at all have to be set at governmental levels or EU level?
I think we don't. It's not either or. The certification schemes, I think we encourage in general, but we try not to take sides with respect to any particular scheme, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So I think they show the way, but they also can, I think we'll probably get into that, there are some limitations. One is that I think we've discussed that there's a certain amount of traction, a certain sector of consumers who'll look for them. But also what wasn't mentioned is that I think a lot of the demand hasn't come so much from consumers, but more from the brands. So they basically want to make sure that they don't get associated with bad publicity. And so they'll make sure that the products they source are from, let's say, reliable sources, or sources that are not associated with deforestation or abuse of human rights.
So you're saying the companies are just doing it for show, really? They're not totally committed?
Well, you'd have to ask. I think it's a mixture of, I mean, nobody wants to have negative publicity because it damages the brand, but at the same time there are business reasons which I think have been set out. So that's also been a driver, but whether that covers the whole market is a question. So then you get into the question of whether regulation is needed or not. And that's still, I think, an open question.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk some more. Yes, Jan Willem.
Now, on that particular point, trade and free trade agreements, I mean, if we take practical examples, for the EU with Latin America, Brazil, I mean, there is the Mercosur, let's say, talks are on. Well, I would assume that if you want to stimulate trade, and that's the objective of the free trade agreement, then you have a sustainable development chapter in the free trade agreement, and then you want to encourage trade in sustainably produced products, raw material, and products. So I think that conditionality, I think we want to see built in the free trade agreement as a principle. And then, of course, what it requires is a good program on the ground to make it happen. So it's all about let's say, the transformation, let's say, on the ground. So, but a free trade agreement you have for about, let's say, 10 years more. So you have a certain, let's say, period of time to have the program in place in order to make it happen. The same goes with other countries. The EU has a whole range of countries where current negotiations are on or will start soon, including Malaysia, Indonesia. So I think that is the request from our side. And that will only help us in the industry to continue to work on the programs we're working on right now.
Okay. Yes, Tony Long from WWF.
Yes, Tony Long, WWF. I just wonder if I could pursue that a little bit more with companies in the lead, clearly progressive companies like Unilever, Tetra Pak, and other members of the ACE trade association. Are you saying that you'd go further than having a principle in a free trade agreement and going further than transformational possibilities, but that you'd actually try to make the trade agreements legally binding, for instance, in application of multilateral environmental agreement provisions, ILO, International Labour Organization provisions? Are you saying that as leading progressive companies, in order to catch the laggards, that you would be willing to have legally binding free trade agreements rather than just principles?
What's your, Mario, do you have a thought on that?
I think we believe that we can be leaders and start doing things that are going direction of sustainability. And I think that in the end of the day, I think that everybody would benefit if there would be a level playing field. That would be equal for everyone, and everybody would have a responsibility for understanding where their sourcing is coming from and take responsibility for that. We might believe that right now this is our role, we want to do that, but along, we hope that there's going to be a day when everybody's going to be doing that, either because it's what is expected from everyone or because everybody perceives that this is something that has to be done in order to keep prosperity in business as well.
Jan Willem?
Well, recently there was a discussion about the standards with the US on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement.
Yeah.
Catch the headlines, discussions in the European Parliament. We know that in the mandate for the negotiations, this is included. The EU has discussed that when they started the talks, and it is included there. But from our point of view, we now have to make sure it is delivered in the negotiations, so the end result in negotiations to capture what is included in the mandate. And we, together with the European Parliament, will be monitoring this. And if, let's say, for other countries, with the US you can say, well, we can agree on standards, but also for other countries where certain things may be more difficult, we also need a sustainable development chapter and really stimulating trade, but trade in sustainably produced goods, products, raw material. And if that is included in the agreement, we in the private sector will be, let's say, served by this agreement, and then our programs, let's say, with the roundtables and the certification are only facilitated if governments can help us in this context.